When the dust settled on World War II, the world breathed a collective sigh of relief. The bad guys lost, the good guys won, and everyone lived happily ever after, right? Wrong. So wrong. Because for some of the most twisted, evil, and high-ranking members of the Nazi regime, the end of the war signaled something new, a career change. You see, we're about to pull back the curtain on the most infuriating, unbelievable, and downright insane post-war lives of Hitler's top brass. We're talking about the Gestapo chief who might have just vanished into thin air. We're going to expose the Naval Genius who went from commanding U-boats to advising NATO. And you are not going to believe the story of the literal architect of the final solution, the man who managed the logistics of the Holocaust, who was found living a quiet, unassuming life in Argentina. We're going beyond just who went to jail. We're digging into what actually happened to the Nazi generals after the war. And the answers are 1,000 times crazier than you could ever imagine. We're gonna start with the story of a man who took all of Germany's secrets and sold them for a brand new job. Okay, so imagine you're one of Hitler's top intelligence guys. You're General Reinhard Gehlen, and your entire job is knowing every single secret about the Soviet Union. You have files, contacts, and a network of spies that is second to none. But there's a small problem. Your boss just put a bullet in his head, and your country is in ruins. What do? If you're Gehlen, you don't panic. You strategize. The guy saw the writing on the wall months before the end. He knew the next big global throwdown was going to be between the USA and the Soviet Union. And what's the one thing the Americans desperately needed? His brain. So Gehlen carefully microfilmed his entire archive of Soviet intelligence, packed it into steel drums, and buried it in the Austrian Alps. It was his golden ticket. When the Americans captured him, he didn't beg for mercy. He strolled in like he was there for a job interview, basically saying, guys, you have no idea what you're doing when it comes to Russia, but I do, and I can give you everything. It was the ultimate power move. The Americans, terrified of Stalin, basically said, you're hired. They literally flew him and his top Nazi intelligence officers to the United States, set him up in a comfy fort, and let him build a brand new spy agency from scratch, all aimed at the Soviets. This little group, known as the Gehlen Organization, eventually became the BND, which is Germany's version of the CIA. I'm not kidding. The modern German intelligence service was founded and run by a Nazi general, using his old Nazi spy network, all bankrolled by American taxpayers. For years, this guy was the West's #1 source on everything happening behind the Iron Curtain. It's the most insane, morally bankrupt job application in history, and it actually worked. But as insane as Gehlen's story is, it's not the one you're going to be telling your friends about tomorrow. That honor belongs to the man who personally managed the Holocaust, Adolf Eichmann. And later in this video, we're going to detail the incredible movie-worthy story of how Mossad commandos snatched him off a street in Argentina in one of the most daring spy missions ever. You do not want to miss that. Now, if Gehlen's story is about a seamless, if terrifying career transition, the tale of Heinrich Müller is something else entirely. This guy wasn't just any paper pusher. He was the head of the Gestapo, the actual real-life chief of the secret police, the man who answered only to Himmler and Hitler. He was the boss of the guys in the long leather coats. Müller was last seen in Hitler's bunker on April 29, 1945. Just one day before the Führer offed himself. He told people he had no intention of being captured by the Russians, and then, poof. He was gone, just straight up vanished. For decades, intelligence agencies all over the world were obsessed with finding him. Was he dead? Did he escape? The theories are wild. One body dug up from a mass grave was misidentified as his, but that was later debunked. The CIA got tips for years that he was hiding in plain sight, maybe in Panama, maybe in Argentina. Every lead turned into a dead end. He remains the highest-ranking Nazi official to have never been captured or confirmed dead. Think about that. The man who personally oversaw the Gestapo's operations, who knew every dark secret of the regime, just blinked out of existence. It's like the boogeyman of the Third Reich simply evaporated, leaving one of history's most chilling cold cases behind. And if you want to make sure incredible stories like this don't just vanish from your feed, the only way to solve that case is by hitting the subscribe button. Did he pull off the greatest disappearing act of all time? We'll probably never know. But while Müller was a ghost, our next guy was the complete opposite. He hid in plain sight for decades, not by being clever, but because he was being protected by the good guys. Let's talk about Klaus Barbie. This man was known, and I mean known, as the Butcher of Lyon. During the occupation of France, he was the head of the Gestapo in the city of Lyon, and he earned his nickname with enthusiasm. He was infamous for personally torturing French resistance fighters and Jewish prisoners, including children. He was a monster, plain and simple. simple. So when the war ends, a guy like that has to be number one on the most wanted list, right? He's a sadist, a murderer, a war criminal of the highest order. And he was. The French sentenced him to death in absentia. But here's where it gets absolutely disgusting. Instead of being hunted, Barbie was recruited. By who? The US Army Counterintelligence Corps. You heard me. In the frantic early days of the Cold War, the Americans decided that Barbie's rabid anti-communist beliefs and his experience in interrogation were useful. What do you guys think? Was a trade-off like that ever justifiable? Let me know in the comments. They hired him, they paid him, they used him as an asset to spy on suspected communists in post-war Germany. When the French government started demanding his extradition, screaming, "Hey, give us the Butcher of Lyon so we can execute him," what did the American agents do? They lied. They covered for him. And in 1951, they smuggled him and his entire family out of Europe using a clandestine network known as a rat line. They gave him a new identity and set him up for a cozy new life in Bolivia. For the next 30 years, Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, lived freely as Klaus Altman, a successful businessman who even became an advisor to the Bolivian military dictatorship. He was only brought to justice in the 1980s after being exposed by investigative journalists. It's a story that just makes your stomach turn. The good guys hired the bad guy because they thought he could help them against a different bad guy. It's a perfect, horrifying example of how post-war pragmatism often trampled all over morality. If you stick around for a bit, we'll get to the story of Albert Speer, a man who escaped justice with a brilliant PR campaign. But before that, this is the one. The man whose name has become synonymous with pure evil. Joseph Mengele. At Auschwitz, calling him just a doctor doesn't even begin to cover it. He was the angel of death. He was the one who stood on the train platform, deciding with a flick of his finger who went to the gas chambers and who would be subjected to his grotesque and sadistic medical experiments. He performed studies on twins, sewing them together, injecting them with diseases. The details are the stuff of nightmares. When the Third Reich collapsed, Mengele was briefly in US custody, but through a combination of forged papers and sheer administrative chaos, he slipped through their fingers. No one realized they had the angel of death in their grasp. This was his chance, and he took it. Using the now infamous rat lines, a network of sympathizers and corrupt officials, he made his way to Argentina in 1949. And what does one of history's most monstrous doctors do with his freedom? He starts a new life. For a while, he even practiced medicine without a license and performed back alley abortions in Buenos Aires. Can you even wrap your head around that? A man who tortured and murdered thousands was now living a comfortable middle-class life, hiding in a community of German expats. He wasn't exactly a ghost. He even felt comfortable enough to use his own name on documents. When West Germany finally issued a warrant for his arrest, he simply moved to Paraguay and then to Brazil. Despite being the world's most wanted Nazi war criminal, and despite the Mossad's efforts to hunt him down, he was always one step ahead. In the end, justice never got him. There was no dramatic courtroom showdown. In 1979, while swimming off the coast of Brazil, Joseph Mengele suffered a stroke and drowned. He lived to be 67 years old, dying a free man under the South American sun. How is it even possible that the entire world couldn't catch one man? It is without a doubt one of the most profound failures of justice in the 20th century. But believe it or not every monster got away scot-free. For some, justice was just massively delayed, as was the case for the man who was so proud of his atrocities he created a photo album of them. You might not know the name Jürgen Stroop, but you've definitely seen his work. He's the man in the famous photograph from the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, the smug-looking officer in the long coat watching buildings burn. And this picture wasn't just some random photo op. It was his victory portrait. Stroop was the SS commander tasked with liquidating the Warsaw Ghetto after the Jewish inhabitants rose up in a final, desperate act of resistance. He did it with unimaginable brutality. He ordered his men to burn the ghetto to the ground, block by block, flushing people out of sewers with poison gas. He personally oversaw the mass murder of over 50,000 people. He was so proud of his work, he compiled a detailed report bound in leather and titled it, "The Warsaw Ghetto is No More," to give to Himmler as a souvenir. He was, for all intents and purposes, a monster who documented his own monstrosity. After the war, he was captured by the Americans and put on trial at Dachau for murdering Allied airmen. He got a death sentence. Case closed, right? Not quite. Instead of being executed, he was extradited to Poland, and for some reason, the process took years. He sat in a Polish prison, but get this, for a time, he shared a cell with a Polish resistance fighter. He would spend his days bragging, recounting his heroic deeds in Warsaw, Warsaw in grotesque detail. He showed no remorse, only pride. It wasn't until 1951, 6 years after the war ended, that he was finally put on trial in Warsaw, the very city he had decimated. He was, of course, found guilty and sentenced to death. In March 1952, he was hanged near the site of the ghetto he had so brutally destroyed. Justice came for the Hangman of Warsaw, but it sure took its sweet time. Okay, after some of those stories, we need one that is just weird. And trust me, this one is one of the most downright bizarre legal footnotes in the entire history of World War II. Let's talk about Alfred Jodl. We're not talking about some back alley butcher here. Jodl was a top-tier general, chief of the operations staff of the Armed Forces High Command. Basically, he was one of the primary military planners for the entire German war effort. He signed orders, planned invasions, and was deeply complicit in the regime's actions. After the war, he was arrested and put on trial at Nuremberg alongside the other bigwigs like Göring and Hess. The prosecution threw the book at him: conspiracy to commit aggression, war crimes, crimes against humanity, standard stuff for a high-ranking Nazi. He was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death by hanging. But here's the twist. Years later, in 1953, a German court decided to take another look at his case. And in one of the most baffling legal decisions of the post-war era, they posthumously exonerated him of the most serious charges. They argued he was just a professional soldier carrying out orders. Then, decades later, the political winds shifted again. The exoneration was overturned and his guilt was reaffirmed. His legacy is this bizarre legal and political football. But here's my favorite part, the little detail that makes this whole thing absurd. One of Jodl's harshest critics at Nuremberg was a British prosecutor who, when arguing for Jodl's cruel and heartless nature, presented as evidence the fact that Jodl had left his dog behind to starve when he fled. Guys, I'm not making this up. Amidst the planning of invasions and the signing of criminal orders, part of the case against him revolved around animal cruelty. Guys, can we just agree that when you're on trial for helping to start World War II, the fate of your schnauzer is probably not the most damning piece of evidence? But moving from the absurd to the infuriating, let's talk about a man who didn't need to hide or get lucky. He simply convinced the world he was one of the good guys all along. Albert Speer. He is easily one of the most fascinating and frustrating figures to come out of the Third Reich. He was Hitler's chief architect, the man tasked with designing the grandiose, megalomaniacal new capital, Germania. Later, he became the Minister of Armaments and War Production, and he was shockingly good at it. The guy was a logistical genius who kept Germany's war machine running long after it should have collapsed. But when he was put on trial at Nuremberg, Speer pulled off the performance of a lifetime. While other Nazis were defiant, blaming others, or just plain silent, Speer presented himself as the good Nazi. He was charming, intelligent, and articulate. He accepted a general moral responsibility for the regime's crimes, but claimed total ignorance of the Holocaust. He insisted he was just a technocrat, an apolitical manager who was seduced by Hitler, but had no idea about the death camps. If only I had known, was his basic defense. And you know what? They bought it. The judges were impressed by his seeming contrition. While many of his peers were sentenced to hang, Speer got 20 years in prison. He spent his time in Spandau prison writing his memoirs, which became international bestsellers after his release. He crafted a whole new image for himself as the man who was sorry, the one who saw the error of his ways. He became a celebrity, appearing on talk shows and giving interviews. It was all a lie, a brilliant, carefully constructed lie. Decades after his death, historians uncovered documents and letters proving that Speer knew far more about the Holocaust and the use of slave labor than he ever admitted. He wasn't the good Nazi, he was just the best liar. He didn't just escape the noose, he PR'd his way back into high society. But Speer wasn't the only high-ranking Nazi who managed a successful rebranding. The man who literally inherited the Third Reich ended up becoming an advisor to the very forces that defeated him. Karl Dönitz. He was the commander of Germany's submarine fleet, the mastermind behind the U-boat wolf packs that terrorized Allied shipping in the Atlantic. He was incredibly effective and deeply respected as a naval strategist. So much so that in his last will and testament, Hitler appointed Dönitz as his successor, making him the president of Germany. So for about 20 days after Hitler's death, Grand Admiral Donitz was the leader of what was left of Germany, and his main job was orchestrating the surrender to the Western Allies. After that, he was arrested and put on trial at Nuremberg. He was found guilty of crimes against peace, largely for his aggressive submarine warfare, and sentenced to 10 years in Spandau prison. Many, especially in the Allied navies, thought this was a bit rich. An American admiral even testified that the Germans had behaved no differently at sea than the Americans had, but he served his time. And what happens after he gets out? He writes a couple of best-selling memoirs about his experiences, of course, but here's the kicker. His expertise was still so respected that former naval rivals from Britain and America would travel to a small German village to visit him. They'd sit down, have a cup of tea, and just talk naval strategy with the former Grand Admiral of the Third Reich. Even more incredibly, his strategic thinking was studied and, in some ways, incorporated into the naval tactics of a brand new organization. NATO, the very alliance built to defend Western Europe from the Soviet threat, was, in a small way, learning from the man who had almost starved Britain into submission. It's a perfect example of how in the Cold War, expertise could sometimes wash away the stain of the past. Here we are, the epic one. Now, this next guy wasn't a general, but his impact was arguably far more terrifying. This is a story of the bureaucrat of death, Adolf Eichmann. Eichmann wasn't out there giving speeches or leading armies. He was the definition of a desk jockey, a mid-ranking SS officer, but his job title was head of the Department for Jewish Affairs. His task? To manage and facilitate the logistics of the Holocaust. He was the man who organized the trains. He was the one who made sure the deportation schedules ran on time. He was the project manager for the final solution. He treated the extermination of millions of people like it was a complex shipping problem. When the war ended, Eichmann, like Mengele, got caught in the chaos and slipped away. He used the rat line network, obtained a fake passport under the name Ricardo Clement, and disappeared. He landed in Argentina in 1950 and began a quiet, unassuming life. He worked in a Mercedes-Benz factory. He had a family. He was just another face in the crowd. For 15 years, the man who managed the Holocaust lived in peace. But the Israeli intelligence agency, the Mossad, never stopped looking. They got a tip that Eichmann was in Buenos Aires. They put together a team of legendary spy agents for one of the most audacious covert operations in history. In May 1960, as Eichmann was walking home from the bus stop, a team of Mossad agents snatched him off the street, shoved him into a car, and took him to a safe house. They drugged him, dressed him in a flight attendant's uniform, and smuggled him out of Argentina on an El Al flight. It was an illegal kidnapping, a massive violation of another country's sovereignty, and Israel did not care one bit. They put Adolf Eichmann on trial in Jerusalem in a specially constructed courtroom with a bulletproof glass booth for him to sit in. For the first time, the world heard the detailed, bureaucratic horror of the Holocaust from one of its chief architects. The trial was broadcast globally. It was a defining moment for the young state of Israel and for Holocaust remembrance. He was found guilty, and in 1962, he was hanged. It was the only civil execution ever carried out in Israel's history. They didn't just bring a man to justice, they made a statement to the entire world. So after that incredible story, we need our cooldown. Let's end with a tale that shifts gears from great escapes to something different. A great stubborn refusal to admit defeat. Enter Ferdinand Schorner. This guy was a fanatical Nazi, a brutal disciplinarian, and one of Hitler's absolute favorite generals right up to the bitter end. As the war was collapsing, Hitler promoted him to Field Marshal and Commander-in-Chief of the German Army. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler is dead. On May 8th, Germany officially surrenders. The war in Europe is over. But did anyone tell Ferdinand Schorner? Apparently not. Or if they did, he just didn't care. Down in Czechoslovakia, he was in command of a massive German army group, and he just kept fighting. He encouraged his troops to continue resisting the advancing Soviets, even as the rest of the country was laying down its arms. For days after the official surrender, Schorner's army fought on. It was pointless, bloody, and achieved nothing but adding to the death toll. Finally, realizing the gig was well and truly up, what does this supposedly brave and fanatical field marshal do? He abandons his men. He changes into civilian clothes and literally flies away, leaving his entire army to be captured by the Soviets while he tried to save his own skin. He was eventually captured by the Americans, who handed him over to the Soviets. Auschwitz. He spent a decade in their prisons before being released to Germany, where he was then arrested again and imprisoned for a few more years for illegally executing German soldiers. He ended up being the last German field marshal to surrender, but don't mistake that for some act of honor. It was all about a fanatical cruelty that curdled into pure cowardice at the very end. So, from Cold War spy masters to escaped monsters, the fates of these men were as varied as they were shocking. But the story doesn't end with the generals. The real horror was what they built, and the terrifying discoveries made as the Allies pushed into the heart of Germany are even more disturbing than the men themselves. So click this video right here because we're diving into the most horrifying discoveries of Nazi Germany in World War II. And trust me, you are not prepared for what they found.